Okay, welcome to AEI. This event's co-sponsored by the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. My name's Colin Dueck. I'm a fellow here at AEI. John Owen is a professor of politics at the University of Virginia. He's the author of several books on international politics. His latest book is The Ecology of Nations, American Democracy in a Fragile World from Yale, published September. And so welcome, John.
Thank you.
And the first thing I'm going to do is just ask you to kind of walk through the basic argument of the book in a few minutes.
Good. Thanks, Colin. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. For those watching, whom we can't see, thank you for watching. Yeah, the book has a lot of moving parts, so I'll have to proceed carefully here. Let me start with what motivated me to write it to begin with. Like lots of people, I am worried, have been worried for a number of years about what's going on with American democracy. Seem to be wobbling. The regime is not as robust as we once thought. And a lot of people have written articles and books about this. It's a glutted market. I study international relations, so I'm interested in the international system and how that affects countries. So one interesting thing about the problems that afflict American democracy is we're not alone. Other, especially wealthy democracies, are undergoing similar problems. Polarization, rise of populisms of far right and far left. This is so different from the 1990s. I'm old enough to, I was in grad school in the 90s and a young professor, so I remember it well. That was a time when we all thought, or most of us thought, democracy had won, or if you don't need to take Francis Fukuyama's extreme view that history was over, but democracy was by far the superior system and just about everybody knew it. And so the real questions were not about is democracy going to survive, but how long is this going to take for, say, China to democratize fully and so on. That was a long time ago. Nobody asks those questions anymore. So the world is quite different in terms of regime-type prominence than it was in the 1990s. I've also long been interested in the 1930s, where the opposite was the case, where it was hard to be a democracy, hard to maintain democracy. Fascism was on the move in Europe and Latin America. Communism was looking pretty strong to many people. And democracy was squeezed from the right and the left in Europe and the Americas. So clearly, democracy is not distributed randomly across space and across time. It clusters in regions and it clusters in times, particular times, and so does authoritarianism. And that's just interesting, and there's a lot of social science on why that would be, but that's a kind of a starting point. We seem to be in a time, not as extreme as the 1930s, but a time when, in contrast to the 1990s, it's just hard to be a democracy, or harder than it was 30 years ago. So that's a kind of opening puzzle. What's going on? When we see this kind of thing happening, we should conclude that what afflicts American democracy, whatever it is, it doesn't just afflict American democracy. We need to look out into the world. We need to look at the international environment, I call it. There's something out there that is affecting countries, lots of countries at once, in similar ways. In the 1930s, there was something out there pushing countries in a different way toward authoritarianism. So this kind of language about environment naturally pushed me toward evolution, and I started to read some years ago lots and lots of biological evolution, theory of evolution in particular, because evolutionary scientists are all about how the environment selects for certain traits, certain genotypes and phenotypes and species. And so I began to think by analogy, is this going to help us understand what's going on with democracy right now in the world, including in our own country? And so I began to push that idea, read extensively. And that's where the title of the book comes from, The Ecology of Nations. To understand the problems of American democracy, think ecologically. Think about what's going on in the world. Think about the environment. So it led me to a couple of things. What is wrong? What's going on in the environment? In a minute, I'll talk a little more specifically about what I mean by the environment. But first, I wanted to say there were two big problems. One was the rise of authoritarian states. Let's start with the more important one, China. China, the country that seemed headed toward not just market economics, but liberal democracy 30 years ago, has in fact become more authoritarian. and it exerts a lot of influence over the international environment. So that's one problem. Let me back up and say, one wrinkle on my ecological story is some countries, like the United States, great powers, have a lot of influence over the international environment. The same international environment that affects the United States, that can select for democracy, if you will, or select for autocracy. The US has a lot of influence on that environment. And it has used that influence in the past to shape the environment to favor itself, to favor its own type of country. All right? So biologists call that coevolution, when the population or the agent shapes the environment that then feeds back and selects for certain traits. All right, coevolution. So that's a lot of what's going on in the book. So China, for a decade and a half or so, has really been trying to, they won't use my evolutionary language, but they have been trying to alter the international environment because they realize it has favored liberal democracy since World War II, really. They're tired of it. They have done quite well in joining this ecosystem in the late 70s. This is largely responsible for China's rise. They're certainly aware of that. But there are elements of the international environment they have never liked, and they are now trying to change those. The most obvious area here concerns human rights, but also internet governance, even elements of international trading rules. These are all environmental factors that the Chinese are trying to change. So that's one problem. I'll throw Russia in because I have a chapter in the book about Russia as well. Not as powerful as China. Its prognosis is not nearly as strong as that of China. But still, it's a factor, and it's certainly asserting itself in its region. So it's trying to shape its more immediate environment to ward off liberal democracy, to make it friendlier to its regime type. And Russia and China they don't see eye to eye on everything, but they are cooperating in some realms to, again, reshape the international environment so it loses its liberal democratic bias and instead becomes biased toward authoritarianism. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is the West itself, the United States. What we've been doing to the international environment. And here, I could go on for way too long about this, but the short answer is the type of liberalism we have been pumping into the international environment for a few decades worked for a while. I call this open liberalism. It worked brilliantly in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early aughts. No longer. It's really sort of not selecting for democracy the way it was designed to do so much. And I make an argument in the book, an extended argument about how liberalism has really changed, itself evolved since the late 18th century when it came on the scene. The first phase was called classical liberalism. It would be familiar to people in the room, I think. In the late 19th century, many people began to think classical liberalism is inadequate to the Industrial Revolution, the needs of the working class. So welfare liberalism, we call it, came onto the scene, finally became predominant in the 1930s with the New Deal and so on, and other democracies began to adopt their own version of it. So welfare liberalism, which involved lots of state regulation, and it also involved the suite of international institutions and rules that the United States and its allies put into place after World War II. The International Monetary Fund, the GATT, now the WTO. These were instruments really of welfare liberalism scaled up to the international system. But in the 1970s, welfare liberalism really began to hit the skids. It really wasn't doing the job. And so lots of experimentation took hold, and we collectively adopted what I call open liberalism, which involved deregulation, an economic side and a cultural side. The economic side, some call it neoliberalism. That's often a pejorative term, but it has to do with deregulation, getting the government out of markets more and more, and opening economies more and more to free movements of goods, services, capital, and even labor. That's the economic side, openness. The cultural side really derives more from the 1960s counterculture. There's a culture of openness, of experimentation, of fluidity, wherein the object, the idea of individual liberty coming out of this era is not the freedom to have a job and have job security. It's really the freedom to create yourself, to create your values. The barrier to this kind of individual liberty, open liberalism, is traditional norms, traditional boundaries, traditional ways, and so on. So these two, the economic so-called neoliberalism and the cultural 1960s, I call it social liberalism, really fused together. And in the most obvious instances, the so-called third way of Bill Clinton and Gerhard Schroeder and Tony Blair and Jean Chrétien and other third-way politicians in the 90s who said this is the new centrist coalition, the new centrist way to be a liberal democracy. So the problem there is the real openness, and this is not an original critique of mine, but the openness, particularly openness to China, has led to lots of economic displacement, discontent, lots of poor communities, people who realize their prospects are not what they've been told they are, both economically and culturally. The culture of open liberalism really is alienating to vast portions of especially small town and rural populations in Western countries. So we have been putting this deliberately into the international environment where it has affected all sorts of countries. And so in the book, I also critique this. I say, well, so in other words, what's wrong with democracy? How does my ecological argument help us understand? Well, one is, again, China and Russia are trying to change the international environment and make it friendlier to authoritarianism. But we can't blame it all on the foreigners. We need to look at our own policies, the type of liberalism that has led to such discontent in this country and elsewhere, and rethink that. So I call in the end, in a bit hazier fashion, for some rethinking, for a way to think about handling China and Russia and the authoritarian challenge, and also ways to think about liberalism and how we might reconstruct a new and more adequate liberalism for the middle of the 21st century. So that was probably more than 10 minutes, Colin, but I will stop there.
No, that was fine. First of all, I think you do a great job in this book of providing kind of a big picture take on what's gone wrong. There's a lot of people who seem to have a little feel for one element of this or the other, but I think that biological model where you bring the domestic and the international together is really unusual, and it's very persuasive. So well done.
Thank you.
So I recommend it to our audience. So I have a few questions myself before we kick it out to the audience, which is, first of all, just sort of walking through the chapters, this notion of coevolution, which in some ways is very persuasive between the domestic and the international. I mean, everybody likes to beat up on realists, right?
Oh, yeah.
International relations realism. If realism means anything to me in international relations, it means that the environment shapes the actors. Mm-hmm. The actors don't get to choose the environment, right? Individual states, whether they're democratic or not, might want to behave in a certain way, but the environment is what it is, and it forces you to act in a certain way. So, for example, in the American case, you could say at the very beginning of the 20th century, Americans would rather not have developed the whole apparatus of international power politics, right? Covert operations, standing armed forces, secret diplomacy.
Right.
And that tradition is very powerful even to this day, but they had to.
Had to, yeah.
We had to. Yeah. So we did. So the real story is kind of this tension, an undesirable tension between what we would like to do and what we have to do.
Yeah.
That's not so dumb. I think that's the realist case.
Yeah.
Why do you think that's wrong?
I don't think that's wrong. My beef with realism, and if realists didn't exist, we'd have to invent them, I think.
Right.
Colin. They ignore two things I think that are very important. One is that world politics consists of more than just states jostling over power and advantage, states fearing attack and intimidation by one, though that is an inescapable element. So I'm realist so far I'm realist. But it also consists, as I argue in the book, in all kinds of rules and norms and information and other factors that affect not just how secure states are, but what kind of state you have. Is it going to be a democracy or an autocracy. That's just something that realists have not. I mean, I've asked some colleagues, does this make sense? And so, yeah, I think maybe it makes sense. I don't know, but I don't think it's that important. But I do think it's quite important, this ecological selection story, where different types of states get selected for in different environments, okay? The second thing realism doesn't handle as well, though it should, given its emphasis on material power, is the ability of states to shape that same environment, to change it. Now, liberals have taken this insight too far in the past, as if to say we collectively, or maybe certain states, can completely make a new world. So Tom Paine in the 18th century, we have it in our power to make the world all over again. So that's an extreme liberal statement, saying realism is just wrong. Or maybe realism used to be right, but now that we have enlightened democracies, forget realism, we're going to remake the world. So I think that's hubris, and it's brought on all sorts of problems, even disasters in the past. But there is something to it. Great powers, the United States being the main one, can and have shaped the international environment to make it, again, friendlier for democracy. The Chinese know all about this. It really irritates them, and they're trying to change it. So, and I think, a straight structural realist account cannot understand that.
Yeah. Thank you. So you tell a story about the phases of liberalism, which I find persuasive. So you have this classical phase, then you have a welfare phase in the 30s, then kind of an open phase, 70s, 80s, 90s. With that last phase, because it's so important to your argument, I mean, you're willing to admit that the open liberalism actually did a lot of good in some ways.
Yeah, won the Cold War.
Won the Cold War. Okay,
yeah,
so right there.
That's pretty good. Yeah.
That's hard not to like.
Yeah. I'm a fan in that sense. Yeah.
Right. And then over time, there's sort of this tipping where the costs seem to outweigh the benefits. Could you go into a little more detail about where exactly you think the open liberalism was helpful and where it became harmful?
Yeah. So I do think, first of all, I come across, and the real me comes through, I'm a real pragmatist. I think, and by that I mean the world is so complicated. I'm a social scientist. I would love to be able to explain everything all the time. We're never going to do it. We need to try. Social science, political science, my branch of it, needs to try, your branch of it. But we're never going to get there, and we hit problems when we think we're there, when we have a master theory to explain everything. But those theories can go a long way, but the scope conditions, the time and place in which they work and which they don't work, we're not so good at that. So that is a little preface to say, welfare liberalism really was encountering serious problems by the 1970s, right? Stagflation, inflation, unemployment. So the old Keynesian formula for managing the macroeconomy, keeping a balance between, inflation and unemployment. Economists realized by the early 70s they don't quite know how to do that anymore. There's something just going wrong. Also, the cultural welfare liberalism, which was quite conformist. If you look at a high school yearbook from 1958, everyone pretty much looks the same. I have my parents' old yearbooks, and it's quite, in a way, all the high school students, they look old. They look like they're in their 40s. But that was a certain culture. Now, you fast forward to 1970, or when I was coming along, the late 70s, everyone's the same in that we're all trying to look really different. So that's a cultural, and so there's a kind of conforming nonconformism or something like that going on. So that's important. That seems like a trivial observation, but there's something culturally going on there that's really important. And the conformism of the post-war welfare liberal system just wasn't, obviously there was enormous discontent across countries, including in this country, with that culture. And so, yeah, I buy that. I think open liberalism, both culturally and economically, was called for. There's a reason why it took hold when it did, right? And it didn't just start with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, two people I admire enormously. Jimmy Carter, right? Deregulation starts under Jimmy Carter. Helmut Schmidt in Germany. This stuff was going on before the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, but Reagan and Thatcher and others really put it on steroids. So, and it worked because our markets had been overregulated and economies had slowed down too much. And it was time for deregulation, lower taxes, and so on. And it worked. And it really did. I talk in the book about how I think this is partly responsible for the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think the Soviets would have lost eventually anyway, but I think Reagan accelerated their decline, put enormous pressure, mostly economic, but some psychological pressure on the Communist Party, so that when Chernenko died in 1985, the Central Committee's thinking, what do we do? First, our leaders keep dying, and also we don't seem to have any answers to these problems. So Gorbachev and his circle were waiting, and then, well, we have some answers. And the answers turned out to be both good and bad for the Soviet Union. It led to the Soviet collapse. So all of this is, I say, in part because of pressure from open liberalism. It really did unleash market power and creativity and all sorts of things that put pressure. So happy story from our side, and I think for human freedom. But it started to go wrong, I think, in the 21st century. And I'll pinpoint, and this will sound like blaming China for all of the problems, and I don't mean to blame China for everything. But opening China's accession to the WTO, which I favored at the time in the late 90s, it was a bipartisan effort. Clinton administration negotiated it. The Bush administration, Bush 43, put it into effect. Turns out to, and we have lots of econometric work on this, David Altor and others, led to a China shock. And Altor and his colleagues say that 2.5 million manufacturing jobs in the United States were lost to China trade in the first decade of the 21st century. That's not the only problem that hit the United States, but it kind of crystallizes the problem. Economic openness has enriched a lot of people. I think people like me, professors at research universities, have really benefited from this. Probably most people in this room and your social circles have done pretty well by it, but a lot of people really have not. I take seriously data that come out of other economists who look really across societies. Branko Milanovic has a famous elephant graph about who has won and who has lost from globalization since the 80s. And it's quite striking. The benefits are not evenly distributed. So working class folks in industrial countries have really not done well. It's a complicated story, but I think part of it is the deindustrialization that came from openness. So, and the problem here is China is so massive. The cheap labor in China and the way that the Chinese government focused on investing in infrastructure, it's just, I'm sure a lot of you have been to China, but it's staggering, the infrastructure, especially in coastal China. The high-speed trains are just marvelous. The ability to get goods to market is staggering. It makes a beautiful place like Italy look really like Italy needs to up its game, because this is all a product of open liberalism, and I think the gamble, I really think the gamble we took in the 90s was it's going to be fine because China's going to be a liberal democracy. They're going to be rowing in the same direction. They already are halfway there. And that's the gamble that failed. And I wasn't at the forefront of people saying this in the 90s, but I was definitely with those who said, yeah, why would, open liberalism worked on Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, it worked all over the world. Why not China? Why would China be able to resist? China has resisted for reasons I don't fully understand.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think that's right. So, I just want to zero in on populism for a minute. It's a term you use several times, and of course, it's a term the last few years that's got everybody's attention.
yeah.
We've seen a lot of populist candidates do better than expected. Just recently in Argentina, and there may be more. If you go back to the Brexit shock, right? That wasn't expected.
Right.
So your take on populism in the book is kind of interesting. On the one hand, you really, I think, take seriously the concerns that led to this wave, just in the way you've been describing. It was a kind of reaction to an overly open cultural and economic paradigm, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Okay. So that would seem to suggest that voters in a democracy have the right to go into the booth and vote for a populist if they want to.
Right.
The other way you talk about it at times is that there's something terribly disturbing about it, or even illegitimate, that it's necessarily authoritarian. And to me, when I think of populism in the American context, there have been plenty of times historically where, I might have voted for this person if I was alive at the time, William Jennings Bryan. I don't know if I would have voted Bryan in 1896 or not, but he's not an authoritarian. He's representing a specific set of constituents, right? They're Western farmers, and they have a right to be heard.
Yeah.
And then over time, that becomes integrated into more mainstream party platforms.
Yeah.
Why is this latest wave so different that academics have almost seemed unable to wrap their minds around it and seem to insist on constantly describing it as necessarily fascistic, authoritarian, illiberal? What's your take on that?
I'll acknowledge the point that, so many of our colleagues just see this as this sort of a cancerous growth, and the answer would be, I don't know, radiation treatment or something. You have to get rid of it, have to excise it. And if only we could get back to pre-populist America. I'm not sure there is such a thing, but when populists sort of knew their place, or they weren't mobilized, there were a bunch of discontented people out there who couldn't mobilize, and I think that's a real mistake. Also, this a lot of the elite treatment of supporters of populist movements sort of illustrate what I'm talking about. So I link populism and polarization, which a lot of people do. Populism, some populist politicians are very good at ginning up more support for themselves by angering the other side, and the other side always obliges by getting angry and flying off the handle and insulting. So it's quite a neat trick that certain populist politicians have pulled off. So I really try to avoid getting into that. I try to stay above it. It's very hard. It proved a little bit hard to sell the book to some people because they, not my editor, not my publisher, but certain other people thought, they kept demanding, whose side is Owen on? He's got to be on one side. And can at least I get away with not doing that in this book? And I try to, fly above it and look, but look very deeply into it. So all that is to say, Colin, I think I have a lot of sympathy with the complaints, at least some of the complaints of populist voices in this country and other countries. I think there's been quite striking neglect, things going on that people like me didn't notice, and then politicians and policy people whose job it was to notice didn't notice or didn't take seriously enough. The gutting of, the opioid. I'm from North Carolina, graduated from a very small town high school down there, and I went to my reunion a couple of years ago, and it's just a different place than it was in the early 80s when I graduated from there, in not good ways. So I think what has made populism, and I will use the word dangerous with an asterisk, is the way it is. It can take over political parties. So one hallmark of populism is to say we are the real Britain or the real America, implying that people who aren't in that group aren't really American. They're something else. And I think in a democracy, you simply can't have, in a liberal democracy, you can't have parties that are deliberately exclusionary like that. It just doesn't work. You need at least to aspire to have a majority and to be pluralistic. There's pluralism and there's pluralism, but I think my read on what makes liberal democracies function is parties need to aspire, at least in a two-party system. They're, in a parliamentary proportional representation system, sure, like in the Netherlands or Israel, you can have, but in a two-party system where, but what's happened to the GOP is it's been taken over. It's Donald Trump's party. It's a populist party, and the rhetoric, and increasingly so, is we represent the real Americans, implying that about half the country is not real Americans. And I think that's That's trouble in a democracy. So that's where to me the danger lies. Not at all in the aspiration to represent people who have been neglected, people who may not fit in at the my university's faculty club very well, right? That's not where I'm coming from. A democracy needs to represent everybody, but that's the point. A party should aspire not to be exclusionary, but to be inclusive in a two-party system. And I think that's one thing that worries me, because if the other people aren't Americans, they're a problem, they're an obstacle. They can be shoved aside, they can be ignored. A lot of what they do is suspicious at best, dangerous at worst. We need to shove these people aside. They are nefarious. All the conspiratorial thinking starts to take hold, and that's what worries me.
So just shifting to the international level, I liked how you sketched, I think, more than one possibility. One possibility is we end up with two international systems, really.
Right.
It isn't just the rules-based liberal order, whatever that means. There's also a kind of Sino-Russian authoritarian order that is actually, a serious alternative. It's out there, and it is, the relations between these two spheres are not friendly. Okay?
Yeah.
So just to clarify, do you think that's where we're headed with two separate systems? And if so, how do those two systems interact? Or are we still heading to a future where there's really only one international system and it's just up for grabs?
Yeah, great question. I don't know. I finished this draft of the book more than a year ago, and I was hoping by now I'd have some clarity on that. So the ideal types I lay out are, single. So given what China and Russia, especially China, are doing, are we looking at two separate but overlapping international orders? One more or less run by China, or where China is the hegemon, and the other where the United States is hegemonic with EU partnership and Japan and so on? Or are we looking at a single international environment, international order, where the US and China and other players, as India becomes more powerful, it's in the game too, the European Union definitely in the game, struggle to shape the environment to their advantage. So those are ideal, typical, pictures. So in favor of the second one, the single, is splitting into two blocks brings enormous opportunity costs, right? Both the United States and China and lots of other countries have done so well, have generated so much wealth through globalization, right? Through being able to locate, through value chains, being able to locate production for an iPhone, this thing I just pulled out of my pocket. I don't know how many countries an iPhone comes from, right? Assembled in Shenzhen province, China, but the components come from all. So those are real efficiency gains built into that system. So if the world sort of bifurcates into two economic blocks, a lot of those efficiency gains will be lost, right? Just to put a fine point out, all that, the China price, so-called cheap Chinese labor is gone. Depending on where Vietnam goes, Vietnamese labor, right? We don't know Southeast Asia where it would go in a two-block world, but in any case. So the cost would be enormous. There are a lot of interests, concrete interests in this country and others that don't want that to happen. So when Xi Jinping was in California recently, had a meeting with, I was reading in the Wall Street Journal this morning, Jamie Dimon, I can't remember who all, but some real finance people, had dinner with Xi Jinping, were applauding him, just trying to stay on China's good side to prevent this kind of two-block world from emerging, right? And I get it, there's a lot of money at stake. And that may be enough to keep it from happening, all right? And the virtue of a single global order where the US and China are, competing to shape the rules, to set the rules in their favor, is I think that the probability of even a Cold War is less. Because there's a single world, and the rules apply to everybody, and it's just a question of who influences the rules more, who gets to interpret them, who gets to place more people high up in the IMF, and that sort of thing. The two-block world, again, an ideal type. Why would the world move to that? I don't think anybody wants that world. Maybe they do. I don't think the Biden administration or Xi Jinping wants that world. It could emerge nonetheless. If I'm right, if my arguments are right, then both the United States and China have some incentive to decouple from the other. Not so much economic, but, well, I'll start with national security, which is already happening, right, in certain tech sectors. The USA, the CHIPS Act of last year is a move in that direction, where in Washington they're thinking about strategic technologies that they don't want China to be as up on as they are. China has done enormous intellectual property theft over the last few decades, so trying to put a halt to that. So start with national security, but also my main argument has to do with safeguarding liberal democracy in this country and elsewhere. And so if I'm right that China, as it's gained power, has more and more tried to reshape the international environment to make it friendlier to autocracy and less friendly to democracy, the U.S., insofar as we care about preserving democracy, we want to separate from the international environment that China is constructing and continue to have our own. China would have the same incentive, right? If China thinks, well, we're trying to remove the liberal bias from international order, but the Americans and the Europeans are thwarting us, they won't let it happen. We Chinese have an incentive just to have our own ecosystem, right? So this is all kind of abstract. What that would look like in practice, I can't really say. I think you can see hints of it with China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is starting to look, now there are a lot of failures with the BRI. It's not working as advertised, but nonetheless, China has poured a lot of infrastructure investment into a lot of countries that are both economically and increasingly politically beholden to China, and they like doing, at least the leaders like doing business with China. And so China may be forming an economic and even a political bloc. You can also think about the way, so the Obama administration negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which was deliberately designed by, I have a section in the book about this, deliberately designed, and Obama was really open about this, to enable the United States and the West to shape trading rules in the Pacific so that China couldn't shape them. China doesn't like things like high labor standards. It doesn't like the transparency that the TPP would have required. China wanted, opaque, authoritarianism's fine. It's all about the goods and the money being exchanged, right? China didn't like the TPP, was quite pleased when the Trump administration withdrew the United States from the TPP, and then started their own trading bloc, which is far less intrusive than the TPP. So a two-block world would also look something like that. China forming and being hegemonic over trading blocs that are more to its liking, that are not concerned with transparency and democracy, and the United States and the West with the trading blocs we prefer, which do have to do with transparency, rule of law, and things like that that the Chinese don't like. I do not anticipate a complete, certainly economic separation. I think the cost so I don't anticipate something like the United States and the Soviets had in 1955, where there's almost no economic interaction. Maybe something a bit more like the US and the Soviets in the 70s with détente, where there is trade, there is some investment, there's intersocietal exchanges, right? So I'm not predicting this is going to happen, but I think it's important to think these things through. 20 years from now, what's the world going to look like in this sense, international order, international environment? And we could be looking at two separate but overlapping blocks, one geared towards supporting authoritarian capitalism, let's call it, one geared towards supporting liberal democratic capitalism.
Okay, let's shift to questions from the audience, and please raise your hand if you're interested, and we'll pass this around right here. And introduce us to your name and then ask your question, please.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti, and I spent most of my career negotiating international business deals for ComSat, IBM, VeriSign, international companies. And I'm delighted to have an opportunity to ask you to react to one of the detailed comments a Chinese government official made to me one time, because you've mentioned China many times, and it's fair to, this is what they would say about your whole theory, which overlaps, by the way, there's some overlap between them. And the argument that he presented to me was that this whole discussion has nothing whatsoever to do with democracy. Stop pretending that democracy is this is only tribal geopolitics. As they said in Game of Thrones, bend the knee. Which countries are going to bend the knee to you, and which countries are going to bend the knee to us? And he had two proof points. I had no way to react. Somebody who's thought about it like you might. Number one, you fundamentally redefine what democracy is whenever you feel like it. Up until 1920, women could not vote. And after 1920, women can vote. So if you change your mind, so everybody has to jump when you said women can't vote, women can vote. And if you change your mind and say women can't vote, then we have to jump or we're not democratic. Number two, sometime in the 1970s, you said people over the age of, over the age of 18 can't vote. And then you said, no, people 18 can vote. And now if you change it again and say people over the age of 60 can vote, or people over the age of 8 can vote, we all have to jump to your tune. So you fundamentally redefine what democracy is whenever you feel like it, and the whole world has to do whatever you say, or we're not democratic. His second proof point was, and then you have the nerve to admire the limited democracies of Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Bahrain, and in the Cold War, the juntas in Spain and Portugal and Greece, and these are limited democracies. So stop fooling anybody. Nobody in China believes your poppycock about democracy. This is purely and only tribal geopolitics. So how do you respond? You've already said some of that yourself, actually, but how do you respond to what the Chinese told me? That caught me off guard, so I didn't respond.
No, and Saudi Arabia is not even a partial democracy. It's not much. I don't see much democracy there at all. But yeah, so these are good points, and I certainly agree that national competition is essential to this story. I mean, you can't get away. It is U.S. versus China. But I'll put it this way. The United States is not just a country with a military and an economy. It's a republic. China is not just a country with an army, with a PLA and an economy. It's a Leninist state. And that matters. So if the Chinese really thought regime type had nothing to do with it, they wouldn't worry about liberal democracy, but they do. It's a national security problem for them. So they're not indifferent toward regime type either, or they would. So I discuss in the book document number 9, which Xi Jinping and his people propagated right after he took power in 2012, which zeroes in on what they call Western constitutional democracy as the chief threat to China. And it goes all through how this is seeped into our bureaucracy, into our students, into our professors, into our business community. It has to be eradicated, et cetera. So that's one, that may seem like a cheap shot, but I think it's really quite serious that they recognize that democracy is at work here as well, and they regard it as a big threat. They are certainly correct that the United States, certainly in the Cold War and most of what we then call the Third World, was actually not supportive of democracy, was afraid of democracy, indifferent at best, and sometimes opposed to it, right? Iran, 1953, Chile, 1973, and so on, right? They're right about that. And even now in the Middle East, although it's interesting, it's more or less only the Middle East now, the United States is afraid of free elections in some countries. Look at during the Arab Spring, the way the Obama administration was nearly panicked over the possibility that the Muslim Brotherhood would take over Egypt in early 2011. And so they were talking to, Mohammed el-Baradei. Could he be president? He's a secular guy. Well, Egyptians had never heard of him. So they're right about that. So I fall back on an auxiliary argument that is a little bit complicated, but it goes something like this, that there's, for most of the Cold War, liberal democracy was the leading, the most popular system among elites in the industrialized world, but not in the less developed world. In the 80s, that began to change. Elites in the Philippines, in Congo, in certainly South Korea, in India, began to cotton toward free market, liberal democracy a lot more, and to sour on socialism, especially state socialism. And that's when the United States began to promote democracy in the so-called third world. Only then, when the ideas that were coming out of the United States and the West began to really take hold in these places. And they are still very powerful in most parts of the global South, not so much in the Middle East, right? And that's the one area where the United States does not promote democracy. The Bush administration tried it in a few places. Palestine didn't really work. That's why Hamas is running Gaza, right? So lesson learned. The Middle East is still a tricky place for free and fair elections as far as the United States is concerned. But so those are my answers. But I get the same. I've gotten the same questions, and they're quite important questions. Yeah.
I'm going to ask a question that was sent by remote from Martha Bales.
Martha Bayless, yes, good.
Okay. I would appreciate your take on the current state of U.S. public diplomacy. Have we abandoned the effort to explain and defend the principles underlying our system of government in a way that does not turn a blind eye to the difficulties that system is now facing?
Yes, thank you, Martha. I know Martha up in Boston, who is a scholar of public diplomacy, among other things. I think so. I would defer to Martha on this, but I think since the 90s, the United States has not funded public diplomacy the way it ought to, I think, and there's a lot of recognition, but very little done about it. I think some people in Congress think it's a waste of money, but I call it the information environment. I didn't invent that term, but I think one element of the environment that selects for or against democracy internationally is information. And it's information about how well does democracy work? Is it actually a good regime? Does it work as advertised? Does it lead to stability, wealth creation, fairness, or not? Does it lead to instability and a skewed distribution of wealth and so on? Elites all over the world pay attention to this a great deal. This is a somewhat understudied area of international relations, the degree to which elites across countries pay attention not just to policies, does free trade work? Do we want to, pegged currency, or do we want to let our currency float? Yeah, they pay it. But they also pay, is democracy really a winning system? Or is the China model a better way to get to have a powerful competitive state? And so the United States has a story to tell about this, and I don't think we tell it as well as we should. We're in a particular time now where we're lacking confidence in our own regime. And, there are reasons for that. My students, a lot of them, I try to kind of suss out, how do you feel about this country's institutions? And, there's kind of a demoralization at best, I would say, among a lot of my students. They're not sure we have a good regime. They don't know what the good regime is. So part of the problem is I'm not sure we believe enough in our own system, but we should. We've been around for more than 2 centuries and have been through some rough patches and have done really quite well in the broad sweep of history. I think also one of the hazards, and this gets into the work of Joseph Nye, soft power, which some of you will be familiar with. One difference between a democracy and the way it gets its story out and an authoritarian state like China is the democracy, because it has private actors get this, Hollywood or Taylor Swift or they get this story out about what America is like, what kind of country this is. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't have that problem. It can put the clamps on civil society. It doesn't really have civil society as we understand it. So the state, the party really can control the message. The good news is the democratic way of doing it, decade in, decade out, has worked better. Even the Chinese will acknowledge they have a soft power deficit. They've tried various things, Confucius institutes and so on. They just don't really take. Whereas the Western liberal democratic system, for all of its risks and weirdnesses, it seems to have an attractive power even now. Again, that's what worries the Chinese Communist Party, the attractiveness of liberal democracy. So Martha, I didn't give you a straight answer, but I think the quick answer is yes, we don't do enough. We have a story to tell. The story's being told, for better or worse, but I think we need to be a bit more deliberate about how we do that.
We've had a hand up over here.
Used a present or future tense on China like they're trying to do something. A realism could be, if you look back 30 years, they thought they'd have a different solution now, but it seems to have been defeated. So they're looking to how, like, the Biden scandal now may be the tip of the iceberg of colleges and Democrats were selling out America for 30 years, and China thought they'd now have a solution in place, and now they're trying to find another way to change.
Do you have a question? Is that a question?
Well,
Is it?
leave out the question.
Do you think? Are you asking me if China has peaked?
Is it a realism in your? Well, it's.
Okay, we'll let the professor speak. Go,
Yeah.
take it, everyone.
Well, I heard a couple of things. So things haven't worked out the way China thought they would. Is that or?
You used the present tense. Are you looking at the Chinese? They're right now saying they had a 30-year plan of Americans selling out.
Yeah.
Now it's not that reality. They had to change. They thought they'd have a change by now. Are you?
We thought the Chinese would have changed, or
No.
the Chinese thought. Sorry.
The Democrats being it's like the Clintons post-Constitution. There was a lot of things the Democrats are doing in the universities, getting the Chinese funding. America and the Biden scandal getting money. There's part of the scandal now with Biden is they're not the only people that were getting money from China.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And how much was China thought they had bought to change?
Yeah.
And now that's been turned back by the Tea Party.
Right.
And Trump switching parties over and joining the
Yeah.
movement to bring back American values.
Right. So, I think that the Chinese, my reading on the Chinese on this is they thought we will, and they're very skilled and subtle at trying to affect politics within democracies. So in a much more pointed way in Australia, and now we're finding out in Canada. Colin's originally from Canada, my wife from Canada, so I pay attention to north of the border. And they've tried some of this in the United States, mostly through business ties, right? But they realize this might not last forever. There might come a point at which resistance takes hold in some of these, in the United States and other democracies, and that is happening. The Trump administration, as you can tell, I'm a critic, but they wised up. They were pretty smart about seeing what's going on with China and changing direction, and the Biden administration has followed the Trump administration in that, as far as I can tell. So what the Chinese are doing instead is they are using more of what I'm talking about in the book. They're not as able to, I'll use the word manipulate, that's a bit of a loaded term, but not as able to influence American politics as they have been, as they want to be. But they have other tools in the toolkit having to do with international rules and institutions, having to do with turning back. So one thing they do, they don't forcibly promote authoritarianism. They don't. As far as open sources tell me, they don't do that. They don't want to do that. But they do enable authoritarianism in the global South by, for example, exporting very high, in the Belt and Road Initiative, very high-tech surveillance and database equipment. The so-called smart cities programs that Huawei exports to sub-Saharan Africa. Authoritarians love this. It allows them to monitor their populations, especially their urban populations, in a way they long dreamt of doing. So the Chinese have other tools in the toolkit. If they lose their ability to influence the United States, they can do other things. So,
Let me actually follow up on
yeah,
I mean, there's no doubt the Chinese have a whole range of techniques they're using, subversion, espionage. So just pivoting to how you think the Biden administration is doing in tackling all these challenges you talk about. You know, the president seems to be stuck at about 40%.
yeah,
In some ways, he seems to be doing what you would recommend, which is, at least on the economic front, you know, tone down some of the open liberalism, quote unquote. Obviously, there's some people that don't like this because they would rather see free trade. But in a way, he's kept some of the Trump administration's protectionist turn. And they're spending a lot of money at home, big, you know, spending bills, industrial policy. So there is a little bit of this on the economic side, right? At least I think that's what they think they're doing. On the cultural side, no. I mean, they're not. They're just continually pushing the cultural liberalism. So that's, you know, a separate issue. Why, if they're at least trying to do what you're suggesting on the economic side, are they stuck at 40?
Yeah. I think people are thinking about other things. You know, most voters aren't really thinking about the China challenge in any immediate way. If you ask them on a poll, they'll answer the question. And I think my sense is, again, this is impressionistic based on teaching undergrads and talking to relatives and people at my church, so not systematic, but yeah, there's a vague word. China, wow, big country. I don't know, the Uyghurs, that looks pretty bad. I saw some stuff about Hong Kong that looked pretty awful. So yeah, this seems kind of threatening, but I don't know. All I know is inflation's really high. I hate, you know, wasn't able to get a Thanksgiving turkey this year, whatever, right? I think we have a lot of political science on this, what leads people to rate a president up or down. In normal times, it has to do with the condition of the economy, and inflation is the big one, unemployment's another one. So if the United States were at war, that would change, and there are little periods. So when the Israel-Hamas war broke out, that loomed very large, and it's still pretty large for a lot of people. When a year and a half ago, Russia invaded Ukraine, that loomed large for a little while. But then we regress to the mean, and people start thinking about the inflation rate again. So I don't think, I guess if I were advising the Biden administration, I'd say I think you're handling China okay. I would tweak some things, but don't depend on that to get you reelected. You got to do some other things.
Okay, very good. So I think we're getting close to noon. I just want to say I understand that we have complimentary copies of the book to be signed, and Dr. Owen will stay behind to sign them. So please join me in thanking Dr. Owen.